Hello, Jeando.
Hi, Kevin.
Hello. So let's continue the discussion about experience, practice, and judgment. And I'll link the previous videos underneath the video for people watching this. Over to you, Jeando.
Okay, yes, just to remind you what happened last time is that I started discussing experience and practice and judgment because there was this senior teacher that had such an horrendous experience reading FM Alexander. Well, he's teaching the FM Alexander technique, but he has pain when reading FM Alexander. So I thought again about it, and I said, well, yes, that's a very interesting case. Maybe other people have the same painful experience when reading Alexander. So what would be the best teaching practice in order to go around that kind of problem? You can't have people experiencing pain when just reading a book. You know, they need certainly help. So as a teacher of conscious guidance and control, how could I propose something? And so I thought, well, maybe it's more simple than we think. Maybe it would be simply like I did last time, in fact, is to, in fact, guide the person in reading Alexander, so provide some help so that the person could read or could have the book read to him, read to you, without experiencing pain. So I thought about it and I said, yes, that's exactly the point. So it's also the case that I wanted to be clearer about the difference between experience leading judgment and experiments leading judgment. Where is Alexander staying? What is he trying to propose, you know? And I wanted to make it even stronger than last time, this connection between the idea that simple experience is a subconscious experiment. Well, you know, a personal reaction to some stimulus. But this personal reaction to the stimulus is just the start of our work. It's not the end. It's not because the child or the senior teacher says, I have pain reading this book because the style is horrendous, that we are finished. No, this is just the starting point. And so exploring beyond that starting point means a practice, mean a reasoned practice. So I want to continue with this, and I thought that the best was to start to read the book that most people like, which is The Use of the Self. And you will see guided reading is not the same as reading. I want to just first read a page, and then once the page is read, I'm going to go back and start to observe what Alexander is saying and start to try and reason about these different propositions, how they relate to each other, and how they relate to what we know or what we can observe ourselves, you know, whether in our own practice or whether in the practice of Alexander himself. So that's my idea. I'm going to start, and we are page 8. It's the very beginning of that book that Alexander wrote called The Use of the Self. And it's very important to remember what is the subtitle. The subtitle is its conscious direction in relation to diagnosis functioning and the control of the reaction. So conscious direction of the use of the self. That's that. And so Alexander is going to start to explain the different experiments he made, and this will help me define more precisely what I mean by experiment and what difference I see between experience and experiments. You will discover, reading that page, that sometimes, or I would say very often, Alexander confuses experience and experiments as if it was the same thing. It seems that he used the word one for the other, which is not a good idea. It's much better to keep experience for somatic experience, subconscious event, that you feel when something is presented to you, when you react, and reserve the word experiments for reasoned, controlled experiments. You will see that Alexander is not that careful when he writes. So here we go. Let's start with this page. It's page 8. So you should see this on your screen. My experience up till now has shown me, this is Alexander speaking, okay? First, that the tendency to put my head back was associated with my throat trouble. And 2, that I could relieve this trouble to a certain extent merely by preventing myself from putting my head back, since this act of prevention tended to prevent indirectly the depressing of the larynx and the sucking in of breath. From this, that I argue that if I put my head definitely forward, I might be able to influence the functioning of my vocal and respiratory mechanisms still further in the right direction, and so eradicate the tendency to hoarseness altogether. I therefore decided that my next step to put my head definitely forward, farther forward in fact, than I felt was the right thing to do. When I came to try it, however, I found that after I had put my head forward beyond a certain point, I tended to pull it down as well as forward. And as far as I could see, the effect of this upon my vocal and respiratory organs was much the same as when I pulled my head back and down. For in both acts, there was the same depressing of the larynx that was associated with my throat trouble. And by this time, I was convinced that this depressing of the larynx must be checked if my voice was ever to become normal. I therefore went on experimenting in the hope of finding some use of the head and neck which was not associated with the depressing of the larynx. It is impossible in the course of these experiments to describe in detail during this long period. Suffice it to say that in the course of these experiments, I came to notice that any use of the head and neck, which was associated with the depressing of the larynx, was also associated with a tendency to lift the chest and shorten the stature. That's it. So I will quickly start reasoning about the text so that people do not feel too much pain, because this is the text as it comes. Yes, but now there are many questions that need to be answered, because as it is, the text is full of holes. And I want to demonstrate that we are asked to conduct like, an investigation and try to relate what we know, what we can see, and what Alexander is saying to make sense of that text. I'm not saying that the text is making sense of itself. Yes, we are going now to try and see if we can dig into it and see what's hidden in there or what's not said. So the next is coming back. Alexander is starting the page with what he says is his experience. Well, it's an experience that has been gained through a series of experiments in front of a mirror. And he was not only watching what he was doing, like when you watch something, it's not your own kinesthetic sense that is telling you what is happening. You have an objective reading. And so if you imagine doing the same thing with a video recording and that you view afterwards, not during the moment when with a mirror, use a mirror, you have a direct response, a direct stimulus of what you're doing. No, if you use a recording, as we do in the conscious guidance and control lesson, there is, of course, a time where you are not involved and you're watching yourself as if someone else was watching you. So then you are really disassociating your command of the movements from the feeling that you get out of it. So it's really objective. So he had an experience before. That experience comes from a series of reason experiments where he was giving himself instructions of movements. He wanted to move the head forward, for example, and he was watching on screen, on the mirror, whether he was doing so or not. He was listening to his voice to see if his voice was improved or not, and he was also listening to what he calls what I call the breathing noises, which is because he found that he was sucking in air after a sentence. And so he had in this reason experiment given himself the order not to sucking in air. So he was listening whether he was doing it. And also, so when you listen to something like this, you're listening to a sound, of course, that you produce. But that sound is communicated to the air around you and comes back to your ear more or less as you would listen to someone else. Once again, when we work with conscious guidance and control lessons nowadays, we use video recording with sound so that you can listen afterwards how you were sounding when you were performing an experiment in which voice or breathing was involved. So he's talking that in his experience, he had discovered, or his experience had shown to him, a tendency to put the head back as seen in the mirror. And that this tendency to put the head back was associated with his throat trouble. Well, there is one thing here, is that never is Alexander explaining exactly what he means by having putting his head back. We tend to follow his sequence of events, but we need to stop at one moment and decide, what is it? Putting his head back? Putting his head back relatively to what? This is going to be a strong question, because depending on how we answer this first question, you will see that we can conceive his readjustment in completely different ways. So that is one thing. Another thing is that he had found at that moment, the technique was just in its infancy. He had not solved anything, but he had found that just preventing this movement of the head backward was relieving to a certain extent the pulling of the head back and the hoarseness. It's very important to put a stress on this certain extent, because we will see later that Alexander had not not found a solution, like preventing the head back was the solution. It was up till this point the only solution he had, but it's not going to, you will see, to be the solution to his hoarseness problem. You will see that his hoarseness problem was still there from the fact, and you will see this later, that when he decided to prevent the head putting back and do nothing, he was able to, well, more or less succeed. But when he was trying to recite at the same time, it was suddenly impossible to prevent the movement of the head back. And he there found that the movement of the head back was not the cause of the problem, but one of its symptoms. So this is not sufficient, and Alexander must go on. He must continue to experiment. So there is an experiment because there is a decision on his part. There is a decision to in fact decide a new movement. Alexander makes a decision of a new movement. He wants to put his head definitely forward, and in order to influence the functioning of the vocal and respiratory mechanism that he could control when performing the readjustment. He could set himself in front of the mirror. He could continue to listen to his voice, to his breathing mechanism in activity, and see whether he was going in the right direction or not. This is not an experience. This is not passively receiving something. There is clearly the direction of a new movement. He wants to put the head forward. It's a movement. It's not clear what he's talking about yet, but he's clearly setting an experiment in which he's aborting something he could not do before. He's not trying to repeat something that he has experienced before as right. No, he's trying to go further into something that is new to him, that he's never done before. And when this condition is present, we can start to talk about a conscious experiment. This has nothing to do with an experience. You cannot experience something you have never done before. Yes? So he decides at that moment that he needs to put his head forward, and definitely forward, which the definite here means farther forward, in fact, that I felt was the right thing to do. There is here a very necessary ingredient for a reason practice. The reason practice is opposed to the somatic practice, to the subconscious feeling practice. Is judgment of what is necessary to do. For example, which movement of the head should happen when he recites. This can be the result of experience. This can be the result of feeling what is the right thing to do. And here he's clearly pointing the finger and saying that he wants to go farther forward than he felt was the right thing to do. Is deliberately deciding to feel wrong. It's not going to feel as the right thing to do. So you must imagine that you need some capacity of resolve here, of decision, because you are going to try and feel wrong voluntarily. And this is also one of a basic component of conscious guidance and control. It's always necessary to remember that a good lesson is a lesson where you overreach, where you go against the rule of feeling right, the rule of feeling that you're doing the right thing. Of course, if you decide that you're going to go further forward than what you feel is the right thing to do, you're going to feel wrong. So now that this is set, we have still not yet solved the question of what Alexander means by head forward, putting the head forward. So it's necessary when you look at this to expand a little bit your vision, to maybe put the book down for a while and see where you can find any evidence of what the head forward could be. There are two avenues. One is to think, okay, you could, for example, start observing Alexander in activity during when he gives his lessons or on photographs. And you can also, well, read beyond Alexander and see what his, well, teachers and assessors are saying about him or about what he recommended during the lesson. That's exactly what I've done. So we want to know when he says he's putting his head farther forward, we want to know what he's talking about. This is the question. So one thing is to look at Alexander himself. And when you look at Alexander, there is something about the position of his head that comes to the fore. It's not the position of the head relatively to the neck. It's the position of the head relatively to the torso. So this is a hunch I had, and I wanted to check whether this could be right or wrong. It's an insight is good only as long as you start testing whether this could be backed by well, clearly reasoned propositions and reasoned proposition that Alexander has made, of course. So putting my head definitely forward, we see in this picture of Alexander standing, we see that his head is definitely forward, for example, of the upper torso. That's easy. In most people, that's what you're going to see. But it's also definitely forward of the middle torso and the lower torso as well. So we see that the head is forward of it. So I took an instruction given by Alexander to Irene Tasker. Irene Tasker, a very intelligent woman, was also the secretary of Alexander, and he gave her the title of teacher of the Alexander technique without her spending 1 hour in a training course. She just worked with him, she listened to him, she watched every one of his moves, and so she noted also many instructions that Alexander may have given to pupils when she was present. And there is one that attracted my attention. So this is Irene Tasker talking, and she say, I still have the notes I made. So this was written down about this lesson that FM Alexander gave to his her brother. And one instruction FM gave him was reminded vividly with me ever since. After explaining how the coming forward movement in the chair always made people cramp the chest and shorten, he said, never let the body overrun the head in coming forward. Never let the head overrun the body in going backward. So suddenly, this started to make sense. Alexander is clearly observing the position of the head relatively to the torso. Of course, at the moment, he's talking about leaning, about moving the torso around the sit bone when the person is sitting. And he's clearly saying that the head does not lead and the body follows, like most people repeat without reasoning. He's clearly saying that according to the situation, whether you lean or whether you go back, well, you should not lead with the head. You should, in fact, lead with a reasoned movement of both the head and torso together. It's not one that is the cause for the other. If you want the head not to overrun the torso when leaning back, well, you have clearly to monitor the speed of the two objects in space, which means that suddenly the modern Alexander technique axiom that the head leads and the body follows suddenly falls down completely. It's much more interesting. You think, okay, you have to organize your mind in order to be able to decide and monitor two movements at the same time. And maybe more than two movements if you consider that the torso is jointed. If you can move, of course, the middle torso faster forward than the top when you lean forward, for example, well, it's very clear that you're overrunning the head with the middle torso and not the upper torso. So suddenly, there was this possibility that the head forward was not the head forward like we've been told by Patrick MacDonald and his followers, that it's the relationship between the neck and head that we have to monitor first. But suddenly there was this possibility to test whether it was not something else that we clearly see that Alexander has got his head forward of all three parts of the torso. So from there, reading the use of the self gets a new interest it suddenly starts to be interesting to look at it and see whether we can verify the hypothesis or not. Because there is what Alexander is doing. So you can watch different images. There is what, of course, Irene Tasker reports, where Alexander clearly in his instruction demands to consciously guide and monitor the speed of two objects. One is not leading the other, apparently, at least in half the possibilities. For example, when you stand, first of all, you have to lean forward. So then the torso should not overrun the head, but then you have to stand up. When you stand up, you're doing the opposite movement in the extension. So you're leaning back when you're standing. And so when you're standing, you have to switch and say, oh dear, I don't want the head to overrun the torso when I start standing, which is a completely new thing for most modern Alexander teacher. But, well, for me, it was all questions. And these questions had an interest is that I started to realize that it was possible to make procedures to test whether one idea could be possible, whether one could be more fruitful than another. So this brings us to another way. The other way is this one. You can also compare modern Alexander teacher practice and Alexander himself. That's what I'm doing here. So when I came to try it, that's Alexander speaking in the use of the self, putting the head definitely forward of the body. This is my new translation according to what I've read and what I've seen Alexander do, yes. However, I found that after I put my head forward beyond a certain point, I tended to pull it down as well as forward. And as far as I could see, the effect of this upon my vocal and respiratory organs was much the same as when I pulled my head back and down. So Alexander suddenly makes an experiment and pull the head definitely far forward. I imagine forward of the body, because if it was forward of the neck, you have a difficulty imagining how far go forward relatively to the neck, because they are jointed together. And so the joint, the Atlantic occipital joint, has very little give in the way of freedom backward and forward from the head to the neck, or for the neck to the head. So definitely far forward. I just found well, two images that are given to us on the net by one very well-known modern Alexander technique teacher. He's also a scientist, by the way. And well, he's given these two images with a very abrupt statement. He thinks that the one on the left is right and the one on the right is wrong. So that's it. So I have used these two images and I've put on it a few lines. So in the first one, supposedly the right one, according to Mr. Johnson, well, I can see that the middle torso overruns the head. You see the middle torso under the armpit line, and you see that the sternum bone is clearly inclined backward at the top. So it's absolutely clear that he's arching the back. So if the position in the head is right for him, there is a problem, is that he's shortening the torso. So that's exactly what Alexander is saying. He's saying that he's lifting the chest. And we will see that in this lifting the chest, he's doing it by a movement of rotation, and the center of that rotation is fixed at his back. And that because of that, he's protruding the middle torso forward. How could this be right? How could this be the head definitely forward? Well, it's certainly not definitely forward of the body, because if there is only the nose that is just forward of the body. So on the second image, Mr. Johnson is portraying what he calls slumping. So slumping is quite interesting to me, because I see that he's really trying to get the head forward of the body. That's the hypothesis. And exactly, yes, Alexander was apparently correct, because when he put the head definitely forward of the body, we see, a cramping of the chest, a shortening. Yes. So, wherefore, Mr. Johnson, this is right and wrong. So this is finished. You know, when you say something is right and something is wrong, the experiment is finished. For Alexander, this is the starting point. Oh, that's how I construe it in my mind. I say, well, when you understand this, and imagine that you want the head to be forward of the torso as a whole, further forward than he feels. Yes. So would it be possible to go even further and say that, of course, the right image is to me clearly the S-bend posture with uh, the upper torso retracted, the shoulder protruding at the back, the protruding abdomen, everything is wrong in this picture. Yes, but I am interested in the picture on the right where he's trying to put his head forward of the mechanism of the torso. Of course, there is the cramping of the chest and the shortening. But then the question that we must ask ourselves is that necessary? Is it necessarily be so that when you put the head further forward, then you will shorten the front of the torso? Well, there are pictures of Alexander where he's seen that his head is further forward than the bottom of his thigh. There are plenty of pictures like this. He's found a way to get the head forward of the torso as a whole. So there could be some truth in this hypothesis that the head forward is not the head forward relatively to the neck. It's the head forward relatively to the torso. Obviously, it's very easy, according to the psychomechanics of bad use, to bring the head further forward and cramp the chest at the front and shorten the stature. So you can shorten the stature by pulling the upper torso backward, and the head is obviously overrun by the torso in going forward. Or you can also shorten when the head is forward of the mechanism of the torso. This is not sufficient. Just directing the head forward and upward is not going to be sufficient to satisfy the condition that Alexander has found. And that's what he says. He says that during his experiment, he found that shortening was always associated with the same bad use of the voice mechanism of the larynx that in fact led to his hoarseness. So it's possible that he found a solution to organize the torso in such a way that the head, would be further forward than he felt was necessary. This is an open question. This is not a statement of right and wrong. This is just an open statement thinking, well, could it be? Could it be possible to, in fact, go beyond what feels well? For example, when a teacher is going forward with the head like this, well, it's possible that he's helping the shortening at the front. But my interest is the opposite, is could the teacher interfere also in the other way? Would it be possible for the teacher to bring the head further forward from the torso as a whole and try at the same time not to shorten at the front, so that we could have the lengthening of the back? Because there is a lengthening of the back when he's in his slumped so-called slump position, and a very sharp, cramping or shortening of the front of the chest. Well, we need to open this question to procedures. We need to, in fact, construct procedures of movements and see whether it's possible or not to obtain the head further forward than the torso as a whole, while lengthening the front as well as the back, because Alexander was able to do it. So if Alexander was able to do it, he's a human being, well, there is a slight possibility that we could do the same thing too. Yes? So how is Alexander closing? Well, he says in both acts. So remember, there is one that is lifting the chest, backward relatively to the middle torso, arching, lifting back, yes, protruding the middle torso forward, allowing the lower back. It's the first kind of shortening of the stature. Or putting the head forward of the middle torso, cramping the chest, shortening the front of the stature. And that's the second kind of shortening of the stature. There is not one way to shorten the stature. There are at least two here, but you will see there are many others. But these two, in the sagittal plane, when you look at the person from the side, these two are very, very common. Well, in both acts, there was the same depressing of the larynx that was associated with my throat trouble. And by this time, I was convinced that this depressing of the larynx must be checked if my voice was ever to become normal. So the depressing of the larynx is not done by the position of the head. It's done by the different form you can give to the mechanism of the torso. And from there, Alexander continues that page saying, I therefore went on experimenting in the hope of finding some use of the head and neck, which was not associated with the depressing of the larynx. It is impossible to describe here in detail my various experiences during this long period. Suffice to say that in the course of these experiments, I came to notice that any use of the neck and head which was associated with the depressing of the larynx was also associated with a tendency to lift the chest and shorten the stature. I would say, what an anticlimax. Alexander is suddenly taking everything and mixing everything together. The experience and the experimentation is suddenly the same word, and you have to accept this. I don't know if Alexander is doing this on purpose or not, but it's very interesting to remember that he was found infuriating people to see if they were stable enough to set on one side how irritating a situation can be and really reason on the basis of what is really said. So I decided not to make this experiment difficult on myself and to keep an open mind and go back to digging into the text. So he went on experimenting. Fine. He was not satisfied. He was not satisfied, okay? Trying to put the head forward and going too far led to a problem. Not going far enough led to a problem. So he had nothing else to do than to try and experiment some more. So he says he had various experiences. Of course, he did various experiments, reason experiments, decided to move one part, not to move the other, because if you want the head to be further forward than the torso, well, you're not talking about the movement of the head relatively to the neck. You're talking about the movement of the head and neck and the movement of the parts of the torso. That's where I find an anticlimax, because most people will not accept this idea and think, no, he's just saying head and neck. Well, the problem is that his head and neck are associated with the torso anyway. And so when he wanted the head to be very far forward, we see on this picture that his head is far forward of the whole torso and the center of the torso in particular. So if you want that to happen, you need to have a guidance, and you need also, because we will see that every single experiment is done with the mirror. We have a need of really looking at the experiment itself afterward to see whether we have the impression that we were forward with the head, or whether it was a fact that the torso was backward relatively to the head. It's absolutely necessary at this stage to understand that we cannot trust what we feel when we say that we set the head, or we put the head forward, or we wish the head to be forward. No, we want to absolutely control whether it is so or not. Alexander had to do so for one obvious reason, of course, but not only. The obvious reason is that, well, he had lost his voice for hoarseness, so he wanted a solution. So he wanted to hear whether his voice was getting better or not. He wanted his voice to get better. And the second, less obvious reason is that, of course, he was involved into the experiment. When you make an experiment, you want to get to the bottom of it. You want to know the truth. Nobody is telling you what is right or wrong, and you have just to believe. No, you have to make your own mind. I think Alexander was that kind of guy, and he wanted to get to the bottom of it. So the use of the neck and head is not sufficient to, in fact, declare whether the larynx is depressed or not. Obviously, the larynx is attached to the torso. It's attached to, first of all, the top of the sternum. It's attached to the scapula through the omohyoid muscle. So anything you want to reason about the larynx is just suspended between the head and the torso. So it's not possible to imagine that just moving the head will do the trick. I've tried to show repeatedly and repeat that the head forward of the mechanism of the torso meant that you had to control both the movements of the extremities. You have to control the movement of the head, and you have to control the movement of the parts of the torso. So for the moment, that's where we are. And is presenting, in fact, suddenly this evidence that when he says, suffice it to say that in the course of this experiment, I came to notice that any use of my head and neck, which was associated with the depressing of the larynx, was also associated with a tendency to lift the chest and shorten the stature. As I look back, I realized that this again was a discovery of far-reaching implication, and events proved that it marked a turning point in my investigation. Alexander is just saying that there is an association between the head and the torso. Any tendency to depress the larynx was associated with the movement of the head and the movement that lifted the chest and shortened the stature. He's just saying in plain words that you cannot disassociate the movement of the head from the movement of the different parts of the torso. You have to find your solution in this mechanism. You cannot separate and think, okay, I just organize the movement of the head and neck, and everything will flow from there and be fine. The idea that the head leads and the body follow is destroyed once again by Alexander. Yeah.
So with
that
idea there of modern Alexander teachers that the head should lead, that just seems to be an error of reasoning, a logical error. So because never let the body overrun the head in coming forward does not mean the same thing as head leading first. It doesn't mean the same thing.
No.
But they've.
Well, if you don't know Irene Tasker comment, I think that the more people repeat the same ideas, the more they tend to believe in them. The more they repeat these ideas, the more they're going to gather around them people that are going to repeat the same ideas. We are not talking about reasoning. When you start reasoning about these ideas, when you start to compare and to expand your views and read, well, suddenly there is evidence. Listen to what Alexander is saying. He's saying this new piece of evidence suggested that the functioning of the organs of speech was influenced by my manner of using the whole torso, and that the pulling of the head back and down was not, as I had presumed, merely a misuse of the specific parts concerned, but one that was inseparably bound up with the misuse of other mechanisms which involved the act of shortening the stature. If this were so, it would clearly be useless to expect such improvement as I needed from merely preventing the wrong use of the head and neck. I realize that I must also prevent those other associated wrong uses which brought about the shortening of the stature. It's, well, to answer your question, it's written. It's written. It's clear. Uh, the manner of using the whole torso had as much impact on the throat, on the larynx, as the position of the head and neck. So merely preventing the misuse of the specific parts concerned. So they are concerned by the voice act. These parts are, of course, the neck and head, and if you want, the larynx, the voice box. Preventing the misuse of these parts is never going to solve the problem, because the problem is an organization of the whole. All this business of having the head lead and the body follow, and thinking that directing the head above the neck is just a construction. It's not what Alexander is saying. I know people believe in it, and they founded all their practice on this, but you can't find it in Alexander writings. I bet that this does not make the reading very easy, because you don't, maybe the reading of Alexander is painful, because if you start to really dig, well, you start to get a very different picture of what the principle of the Alexander technique are, compared to the principle of the modern Alexander technique. At first, it was not pleasant to me, because I had taught this head lead body follows, this direct your head and everything will be fine. I had been, well, a member of the group, and suddenly I said, well, could this be wrong? Is he not saying that it's absolutely not the case, that if you don't prevent the other uses of the different parts that are not the neck and head, it's not going to be solved by itself by directing the head and neck? That's so. This is well, this is supposed to make reading Alexander more interesting. This is not supposed to, in fact, plunge people even more in despair and pain. I'm sorry. I think I lost it here. But nevertheless, you can't say that the text is not full of surprises. Is not full of questions and interesting problems, and also that it's possible with all the tools we have at our disposal. With now all the books of Alexander are easy to find and to well, to study, with all the books that have been, in fact, produced by the first generation teachers, by his assistants also. Well, it's possible to make us to get an idea. So this is where we are at the moment. This is what I call the end of part one of this experience versus reason experiments, where we see that the different parts of the torso, there is the upper part of the torso with the sternum, and we see that here, this is a description of the Alexander S bend posture. And in the S bend posture, it's absolutely clear that Alexander described a sternum that is inclined backward at the top, with the middle torso, of course, protruding, and the shortening of the back. And we see that, of course, there is the involvement of, well, quite a series of movements that that have to be prevented. And if they are, there is no shortening of the front when the head is clearly forward of all the different parts of the torso. So the game, if forward and up is what Alexander presents, well, it's forward enough of all the different parts of the torso. If forward enough is forward of all the different parts of the torso, then it should be possible to get the head as far forward without shortening the front. That's, I want to stop on this, because I've prepared the next part. In the next part, we are going to look at what Alexander insights. Where does he want us to dig? to get a solution to this organization of the different parts of the torso, in which, of course, in standing, the head overruns the torso, as we see here. Any question?
So when you said there about the head follows, the people say that the head leads and the body follows, but what people have forgotten is that they're forgetting to think of movements relative to other body parts. So when people say the head forward and up, again, it's the confusion between the feeling and the conscious guidance, because they're associating head forward and up with the feeling of head forward and up. When Alexander's talking about head forward and up relative to the middle and the lower torso, relative to the torso, it's a reasoned understanding of head forward and up, not a feeling of it. So then when modern teachers do think head forward and up, it's entirely about the feeling. So as long as it feels forward and up, it would seem to be right. So again, it just comes back to a misunderstanding of what's really is conscious guidance and what is subconscious or guidance by feeling.
Yes, you're right, but also we need to remember that the modern Alexander technique does not pretend to teach conscious guidance and control. They pretend to be a somatic practice. They pretend that they are going to make the pupil feel the right, and this feeling is going to be somehow embodied, and the person will then be able to do right. That's the principle of the touch lessons. So they are not pretending to teach conscious guidance and control. They pretend that I do not teach the Alexander technique, but they don't go onto this discussion of conscious guidance and control. The conscious guidance and control has been totally, I think, evacuated, suppressed in the modern Alexander technique. This idea of directing movements of different parts relatively to each other and relatively to guidelines that are exterior to the person. This is, oh dear, this is engaining. This is not something that does itself, without your conscious will to be involved. It's a completely different world. I do state that I have nothing to do with this somatic practice. I can't understand it. I can't relate it with the books. But in the same way, these modern Alexander teachers, they consider that they have nothing to do with me, with this idea of conscious guidance and control. They find it as if the control by the intellectual, by it's a male and dry, and so I think we are really two different worlds, completely different worlds. It's very difficult to try and reunite the two together. They don't match, no way. So yes, you're right, you're correct. This idea of observing the relativity of the parts, when you look at Alexander standing and you look at what he's portraying for the camera, it's clear that he's playing for the camera, and it's clear that he's organizing the different parts of the torso in such a way that, of course, the head is forward and up relatively to the torso on each image. It's not one image no, it's all images where Alexander is shown, his head is forward of the different parts of the torso. He never lets the torso overrun the head. So his pupils do, his students do, but he does not. He's clearly got a rule of organization of the movements of the part, and to say the least, he's not being very clear to transmit what conscious guidance and control of series of movement could be. There are many different insights in the books about this idea of thinking activity, where the direction of a series of movement is really central. But who's talking about that nowadays? Nobody. So yes, the point of view is that of observing movements. When you watch a person in a mirror, there is only one thing you can observe is the movements. you cannot not observe if there is tension or not, or apart from the face the person is showing. But if it's an actor, you know that with his face he can show any sort of emotion, while he can show a face of great repose, great release, and in fact being pulling like mad on different parts of the torso and legs, and you won't notice anything. So when you watch a mirror, you watch movements. When you listen to the sound of your breathing, you're in fact listening to the effect of the breathing movements. So we do consciously reason movements. And so it's relativity between movements and the geometrical position of the parts. It's a completely different affair when you try and feel whether your neck is free or not. It has nothing to do with it. Yes.
And it's
Okay.
also it's a different affair if you are reading the books wanting to feel good from reading the books rather than to understand what it is he's actually trying to say and then implementing it in your own practice.
Yes, there is understanding of the books, but there is also something more, even more funny than trying to understand. I'm not pretending that I understand the books. What I like is to use the books in order to create questions and then procedures to see whether a question can be answered by yes or no. It's impossible to know if we understand the books, or pretending that one is understanding the books is not what I want to convey here. What I want to convey is that anybody can take the books and read them and try to work with them. Work with the words, work with the different paragraphs. What is Alexander trying to say? What in what Alexander, in what he says here is different what he said in the sentence earlier. We did that last week. Now we are saying, okay, he's following a progression. There is clearly a progression in the start of the use of the self. And what is the progression he's following? Am I forgetting where am I in the progression when I read a sentence? When I read a sentence saying that, he was able to a certain extent, relieve his hoarseness by directing the head and neck. Where are we in the progression? Yes, we have to remind ourselves of the context and think, okay, he's saying that to a certain extent, he was able to, in fact, relieve his hoarseness at the beginning, at the very beginning. Yes. And then when he says that clearly the mechanism of the neck and head was certainly not the cause, we are very further forward into the experiments. So this has to be organized in our own mind when we read Alexander. It's like he's giving you a puzzle and you need to keep the elements in mind when you read. If you forget what has been said 2 sentences earlier or 2 pages earlier, you're lost. I'm not saying that this is easy, but I'm saying that we have the label Alexander teacher or Alexander. We are interested in what Alexander practice can be. Well, then, if that is the case, well, there is incentive enough for us to work at it and start to get a very clear and strong perspective on what he's writing, instead of just emotional reactions to words because he says race suddenly, or race means he's racist. These a very tactile response to Alexander are not really useful. They are not expanding our reasoning, not at all. They are childish and inconsequential. But they have no bearing on our teaching work. Okay.
Okay, this has been a great introduction to how to read Alexander's books for people. So for everyone watching the video, if you want to book a lesson with Jeando and you can do some of these experiments for yourself, I will put links to his websites underneath this video, and we'll see you in the next one. Thank you, Jeando.